One of the major differences that I've noticed between liquid and powder coating when it comes down to the actual material itself is how we have to store the material. So when I'm talking about like paint in the bucket or powder typically comes in boxes, how we have to store that is quite a bit different. So when it comes to paint, that's really flammable, has flammable warnings on it. So we do the best we can to keep those in flammable storage cabinets. So that way, if for some reason it was to start on fire or something, that it'll contain that inside. And then hopefully, since it's inside the cabinet, if there's a fire outside, it doesn't go into the cabinet and then start the paint on fire. Whereas like powder coating, it's not really flammable itself when it's just sitting in the box. If you have a lot of dust in the air or you're in the powder booth and you have sparks going with the powder clouds, then you could have some issues of maybe an explosion or something. But just it actually storing in the box, we don't really think of that as flammable. There's one real benefit there when you're looking at powder because you don't have to keep that in a flammable storage cabinet. So not as much expense in terms of the storage. You just have more leeway in areas that you could put the powder. One thing that is really important for powder is to keep it in a temperature controlled and humidity controlled environment. So you typically don't want to have the powder really, really cold, like down at freezing. For instance, if you had it for whatever reason in a freezer and then pull it out to like shop floor temperature, that's not good to run between temperatures. But especially, you don't want it to be getting too hot in the box. So you want to keep it in like an air conditioned type environment. You want to control humidity because it's very, very humid. Powder is going to try to kind of suck that moisture out of the air and it can ruin the powder, make the powder clump up and turn the powder bad essentially. So, but when I'm thinking about paint, I don't, and I could be wrong in this, but I've never really come across or heard of people being concerned about paint being stored in a really hot area or requiring that it be in like some sort of air conditioned type storage because paint is it's liquid paint. It's got a lot of solvent in it. Obviously, you don't necessarily want to sit in direct sunlight and have it in 100-degree heat, 110-degree heat all day, every day. But the material or the liquid paint itself isn't really, especially if it's unopened and you've never used it. From my understanding, it's not really being affected by the heat that much in a storage situation, whereas powder definitely is. So there's another big difference there to where that powder doesn't have to be stored in a flammable storage cabinet, but it really does need to be in some sort of air conditioned, humidity controlled environment. And it always makes me cringe when I see videos on social media or pictures or something where all the powder coating storage is on a rack out on the shop floor, typically right next to the oven. And when you're have powder out on your shop floor and that's where you store it, I know in the summer you're getting around 100 degrees in the shop or even hotter, and you're really running the risk of that powder clumping up and getting hard and going bad in the box to the point where it could, we talk about like powder gelling. It's probably not going to gel in the box, but you're on your way down that path essentially. Like if you put a full box of powder in an oven for a short amount of time, even if it was not up at the 400-degree cure temp, the powder is going to start to gel and it's going to make like a block of polyester if that's the powder formulation that you put in the oven. So that's really something we can think about, and it's really not good practice to store your powder out in the hot shop. You really do need to have an area for it that's air conditioned, and I understand that that can be difficult. Originally, we had like a break room that was air conditioned, and that's where we kept the powder. Now it's powder storage slash break room. More space is taken up by the powder storage than the area for the guys to take a break in, essentially, because over time we've acquired more and more powder. And so you need more and more space, but you want to try to keep it air conditioned. So you can't just throw it anywhere and it just kind of all ends up piling up. So I understand the struggles with that, but it is really important. When we first started powder coating and for the maybe first 3-ish years, I really didn't think about like so we were storing it in an air conditioned environment and I didn't really think about powder going like bad, quote unquote. We're like Liquid paint, maybe after you've used it and you don't get the lid sealed like you should have, like the top can skin over, or you can tell that like an oil-based paint starts to separate and you just can't get it mixed all back up together quite right. And you can just tell that it's not the right viscosity anymore, not the right consistency. And then it's like, man, this is just bad. This paint's bad. There's no way we're going to be able to spray this. And powder, you don't really come across that much. I mean, it can be clumpy in the box. And so then since we spray straight out of the box, that can be a problem when we're kids that can clog the pickup tube and things. We didn't really struggle with that much, but over time, as we've done it more and more, I started to really understand our process and understand our pitfalls and downfalls and what could be causing issues in the finish. And as I've kind of gotten to the point where I understand everything and understand our pretreatment process and our air filtration, and I know that we're controlling that well and we're doing a good job with that, and we have some checks and balances with that, so we know that we're getting good quality clean parts, and then we're applying a powder to them and we're putting in the oven to cure. And then when the parts come out of the oven and we're seeing some inconsistencies in the powder, or we're seeing fish eyes that are consistent everywhere on every surface and every angle, or specks of let's say you're spraying a dark gray and you're seeing white specks all over the place, and we haven't even sprayed white in a couple of weeks, and it starts to become, a little bit perplexed. And I started to go down the path of like, maybe this powder is contaminated. Maybe there's some issues with it. And I never really thought about it from that way before, because we're buying our powder material from very large companies, well-known paint manufacturers, and you just don't, at least I didn't, um, think or account for that, like they could have some quality issues along the way. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. I always thought that the powder that we were getting, no matter what, was going to be perfect and good, and there's never going to be any problems with the powder. It's always something wrong with our process. But over time, usually about once a year, we come across some powder that's actually bad or just contaminated. And some of the contamination that we see and prove out that it is actually contamination after we work with the powder lab, and then they agree with us. Once they get to spray some of the powder, or they spray retain out of the huge batch of powder that they made, that our box came out of. And some of the things that we see are color contamination, where we're getting specks of a different color in the color that we're spraying. Like I said, like white and a dark gray, or it could be like we've had like bright green and a black. And it's just little tiny specks, but it's very consistent. It's everywhere. It's not like it's just on top of a part, like it fell off of a cart or something. It's on, straight on a vertical flat. It's underneath a horizontal. Like the only way that you possibly could get some specks on it is if it was literally coming out of the gun with the powder. In those cases, we always try to troubleshoot ourselves first and say, like, do we do a good enough color change? Do we have the right color hose on? Did somebody have the wrong color suit on? And we try to go down all those paths to make sure that our equipment isn't causing the contamination. And then we've had some issues with just junk or debris that's been in the powder, like something fell in the extruder and kind of got crunched up. So then there's a lot of like what looks like dirt specks, but it's probably not dirt. It's just something that got pulled through the extruder or and ground up, and it'll leave all kinds of little debris in the powder. Another one is just random fish eyes or craters. And it's different than a fisheye that we would see from like oil, that would meaning that like we have oil in our air, or we didn't get the parts clean enough. It's kind of it's not as invasive, but it's everywhere all across the part. And like I said, it happens to us about once a year, and usually we try to evaluate like, okay, when did this problem start? Okay, right when we opened this particular box powder. Okay, our parts came out bad. Maybe it is our pre-treatment. Maybe it's something with these parts. Let's grab brand new, clean sample panels that are 3x5, and let's spray out 6 of those, and let's see how those come out. And most of the time, we see the exact same issue on those sample panels as we do on the parts that came out. And then it's like, okay, do we have any more of this same color in stock that's from hopefully the same manufacturer, but just out of a different batch or a different lot number. And a lot of the times we do. So we'll pull that box out it's the same color, but it's just out of a different lot. And we'll spray again some 3x5 panels out of that, and the issue goes away. So now we're like, okay, well, we're using the same equipment, we're using the same hoses, we're using the same gun, and out of this box over here, that's out of lot 1,000, let's say, we're seeing no issues at all. But out of lot 2,000, we're seeing all these craters. And so then we make the conclusion like, well, it's probably in this powder. We haven't had this problem all day. It was right when we color changed and started spraying out of this box. We spray out of a different box from the same manufacturers, the same color, it's just a different lot, and it looks perfect. So this is one particular box. When we spray out of it, we have an issue. And so usually we get it all the way down to that. We document it, we take pictures, and then work with our sales rep. And it's usually a long process because typically the lab wants to get that powder back and they want to actually spray their own panel so they can verify. They like pictures of the issue that we have on our actual parts and pictures of maybe the panels we sprayed out or we'll set the panels with. And typically they come to the same conclusion that we did and like, yeah, it is contaminated, and we just work it out. And so I guess the reason why I'm explaining that in depth is just that, again, from when I started, I always thought that the powder was correct and there was never any quality problems ever with the powder. It was always our issue. But now it is a possibility in my mind that, maybe this powder is contaminated. I don't like to jump to that immediately. I like to go through all of our stuff first and see, like, okay, is it possible that we're causing the issue somewhere? Because I don't want to go to all this work and get a hold of the sales rep and cause them headache, and then they spray out the powder in their lab and like it's absolutely fine. Like we've sprayed 20 panels and looks great. For one, that's embarrassing. Two, it's just a total waste of time. So I really try to make sure that we dot all our I's, cross all our T's, and then make the decision like, man, we really think it's an issue with this powder. And it's always a bummer when that happens because since it doesn't happen a lot, it will catch us off guard. We're in a rhythm, we're in a groove. It's a color we spray a lot. We're just pulling the next box out. Sometimes it's out of the same lot that we've been spraying out of. We've been getting good parts out of this powder, out of this particular lot, but we could be pulling a box that is box 1 in the lot. We've been spraying with box 250 to 300 or something. And then all of a sudden we get 2, 3 carts that come out of the oven and it's like, oh, we got an issue. Now what's going on? And usually we trace it back to, oh, we switched to a new box. Okay. And so usually it ends up to be a lot of rework because it's not something that we're thinking about constantly. We have gone to trying to, every time we have a new box of powder, or at least we know it's a new batch or new lot, to make sure that we spray some sample panels before we start spraying the parts and look at those sample panels and evaluate, like, does it look good? Because usually if there's something wrong with it, it's pretty glaring. It's pretty obvious that like that just doesn't look right. We've caught a lot of issues before we've actually even sprayed the production run of parts, simply because we sprayed out a panel and looked at it. So that's been beneficial for us. So I was talking about powder going bad. A lot of powders have an expiration date on it or a shelf life. Let's say they almost all have like a manufacturing date. And generally, everybody kind of goes or says that if it's been on the shelf for more than a year, or it's been more than a year since it's been manufactured, you might have some issues. Some companies will say like, absolutely don't spray it. Others will say just be careful. When it's sitting there for that long, there's a good chance that it's absorbed moisture. One thing that I've noticed is, and I don't know why this is, so our LinkedIn friends that are powder chemists should be able to tell us why. But if we have a powder that is old, so like a year or older, most of the time, everything looks fine when we spray it. Besides, it comes out a significantly lower gloss than what it should. It usually happens with an RAL colors for us, because that we could order an RAL color today and spray a job with it and then not use it again for 2 years. The job comes up again and we still have some powder left over from before. So we just use it instead of buying a new box. And a lot of time it's fine, but some of the time it'll come out and it's supposed to be that higher RAL standard gloss, 85 to 95%. But to us, it's noticeably less gloss, probably down in a 60%. I'm not sure why that is, why the time from manufacture date as it gets greater that the gloss lessens. I'm not quite sure, but that's definitely the case. I think it's partially because that powder has been absorbing moisture, and typically that causes a lot of pinholing in the powder when you look at it under like a magnifying glass. And that phenomena of pinholing changes what the gloss actually looks like because it's a lot of tiny pinholes. And so that changes how the light's reflecting off of the powder. That's my guess, but I'm not 100% certain. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't like to buy a full box of powder that we know that we're only going to use 1 pound. That's why we kind of like to stick to our stock colors, because if we are always buying new powder for every little random job because that's what that person wants, this very particular special color, a lot of customers will be like, well, you can just buy it and use it on other people's products. And it's like, well, yeah, but if it's uncommon, someone may not pick that color again for like a year and a half. And by that time, the powder is probably compromised. So we really only got to use 2 pounds out of the 55 pounds. So it's a pretty big waste for us, and it doesn't even make financial sense to even do the job at that point if we're going to have to pay for a whole box, spray 2 pounds of powder out of it, and then we're just going to have to throw the powder away. So that's why we don't like to order a lot. So usually we're not ordering hundreds of pounds of just every color. Of our really high volume movers where we move a lot of the same color through, then yeah, we're buying a lot. But of the low volume stuff, we try to order as little as we can because we know that there's a potential for it to go bad. When it comes to trying to identify contamination, is since we spray out of the box, directly out of the box as it comes to us, we have a lot less chance of actually contaminating that powder ourselves. The reason why powder manufacturers, whether it's sales reps or the lab themselves, typically want the powder back and they want to be able to spray it out and they want to compare it to their retain is because they're going to take the standpoint that like we contaminated it, not on purpose, but we contaminated it on accident or something. And that I can see where that's a very likely possibility when you're spraying out of hoppers and you're reclaiming the powder. Then when you add all those variables in, it's like, well, you're introducing, like you're spraying it once, it's falling to the floor, you're reclaiming it, you're mixing it back in. At that point, you've opened a whole can of worms in terms of contamination. From our standpoint, we sprayed a waste, so we order powder in boxes, and there's plastic bag liners in the boxes. We literally, we do our color change and we clean up everything really good, and we put a different hose on that matches that color, and we drop our pickup tube right down in the box, and we're spraying right out of the box. And we never put anything foreign or reclaimed back in that box of powder. It's all just the powder as it came from the manufacturer. So when we're seeing issues of that we think is color contamination or we think something is in the powder, we know that we didn't introduce anything into that box of powder because we're not taking it out and transferring it, putting it in a hopper, or then putting it back in a box or reclaiming. So that's one really good key identifier for us, that if we did spray out of hoppers or we were reclaiming, at that point, it's almost impossible to try to say that, well, we know for sure, or we're really, really confident that like this came from the manufacturer this way. I don't know how you could say that when you're adding all those extra variables in. So that's one reason why I really like that we just spray right out of the box, because I feel like we can trust that that box wasn't contaminated by us, essentially. I mean, is it possible that we accidentally got some specks of a different color in there? Possibly, but it's really, really unlikely. One of the downfalls of us spraying out of a box is that we don't get near as good a fluidization of the powder in the box itself when we're spraying it. And so, like, what does that mean? Essentially, like fluidizing powder, you're introducing air into the container of powder and kind of making it float and boil and bubble and move around. So it's called fluidizing. So it's almost like if you stick your hand in it, it kind of feels like water. It's really sloshing around if you're in a fluidized hopper, let's say. And that allows powder to flow up the pickup tube very nicely, very consistently. So you have a very consistent spray pattern and a good cloud coming out of the end of the gun, which allows you to apply a really consistent film thickness, and you don't have spots where it surges and throws powder out onto the part, or you don't have it where all of a sudden you're not getting much powder, so you're thinner in that area. So that there's a really big positive from fluidized hoppers. When we're spraying out of a box, there is a fluidizing mechanism in the pickup tube, but it's kind of locally right around the pickup tube in the box. It works, but you can't really compare it to like a full blown fluidized hopper. We do have some fluidized hoppers. We typically use those for really heavy metallic powders that are not bonded, meaning there's a lot of metallic just floating around in the powder and it needs to be mixed well and it needs to be fluidized well so it all flows out evenly and comes out into a nice powder cloud evenly. That's one thing that is a drawback from us spraying out of a box is that I do wish that everything we sprayed was fluidized. We spray so many different colors though. It would be labor intensive and expensive. And I think some people will disagree with me on this, but I think it'd be really labor intensive and expensive for us to set up individual hoppers for every color that we spray, even if we were putting it in them and leaving the powder in there. That's a lot of upfront costs and all that equipment. And I really don't like the idea of transferring it in and transferring it back out because I feel like there's way too much of an risk for contamination or us just accidentally mixing similar colors together on just total air and accident. We have more of an issue with clumping powder or surging, meaning like a lot of powder coming out of the end of the gun and kind of spitting on the part and just, and then you have to go blow that back off. Sometimes when we have inconsistent film or we have light areas, our default is always like, well, the sprayer was going too fast or the sprayer just missed that or we got too far away. Sometimes I think that actually probably is just the fact that for that 1 foot, while we were spraying down a long piece of aluminum extrusion or something, we weren't getting really good powder flow up the tube and out into the cloud because our fluidizing isn't as best as it could be when it's in a box.